Update on coronavirus, and happy to take questions on that and any other public health topic. But obviously I've been away for a few weeks, and there's a significant coronavirus wave we're going through at the moment. A lot of people have a number of questions. I'm happy to stick around and answer them. The key messages today are that clearly we're in another wave, the BA.4/5 wave, which is yet another challenge with COVID. It's absolutely the case that this pandemic is not over in terms of the challenges to us collectively as a community and to our health system. We're probably at a peak of waves, peak of the wave right now in terms of case numbers, and I expect that we'll see a flattening of numbers and a decrease in coming days. The hospitalisation numbers again will plateau probably in the next week or two, but they're at very high levels, 800, 900, so that's a huge pressure on our health system. But the hospitalised numbers should also decrease as the case numbers come down. And we've seen significant numbers of deaths daily in Victoria for some time, and obviously today's reported number of deaths is 107. There were two routine reports, but 105 additional that related to a data feed issue that's now resolved. But obviously having 107 deaths reported in Victoria on one day is a cause for concern and anxiety for many people. And it doesn't matter that they're historical deaths. These are people whose lives have been lost, and there are families grieving by virtue of that. But it is fair to say these are not deaths that have occurred today. They've happened over the last month. The average number of deaths in Victoria has been around 19 in recent weeks. That's relatively stable, but of course that number is of great concern and is too high. There are a number of things that we can do collectively. I do like to talk about collective responsibility or shared responsibility rather than just personal responsibility. Of course, there's personal responsibility in all of this, but it is a collective effort. We have to think about everyone around us and our health system and our healthcare workers, not just about our individual personal risk, because infectious diseases don't allow us to only think about ourselves. And so some of the key interventions, mask wearing, good to see masks on many of you today. The more people who are wearing masks in indoor settings in particular, the greater the downward pressure on transmission. And even though for us personally, if we're 3-dosed or 4-dosed with vaccines, may not be at extreme risk of being hospitalised or ending up in ICU, but with so much transmission in the community, that spills over to those who are most at risk. And those individuals, even with 3 doses or 4 doses of vaccine, are obviously frail and can end up in hospital or end up dying. And so we have a collective responsibility to be wearing masks as much as we can in indoor settings with shared air, but also outdoors if we can't physically distance, and whenever we're visiting someone who is most at risk of being hospitalised or of dying. 3rd and 4th doses of vaccine. So we've obviously got fantastic coverage with 2 doses, more than 99% of those 70 and above. More than 90% 3rd dosed for those 70 and above, but only about 2/3 with a 4th dose. It can be fatiguing to think about needing another vaccine, another vaccine, another vaccine. But a 4th dose reduces your risk of being hospitalised and dying by 3/4. So a 4-fold reduction in your risk of dying with that 4th dose. And we are seeing people who are not up to date with the recommended number of vaccines being overrepresented in hospital, overrepresented in our death statistics. And so I do encourage you, if you're due for a 4th dose, please get it. If you have family members, parents, grandparents, in residential aged care in particular, but anywhere, if you're due for a 4th dose, please get it. If you've recently had COVID, you have to wait 3 months. That's the ATAGI recommendation. That's really in consideration of the fact that you're going to get the best boost with that 4th dose at around the 3-month mark after having had COVID previously. The other thing to note, and this makes a difference in terms of hospitalisation and dying as well, is that the oral therapies Paxlovid in particular, but Molnupiravir as another one. These are drugs that can make a difference, make you recover in terms of your symptoms and in terms of the severity of illness, and keep you out of hospital and ICU. Make a plan with your GP, especially if you're one of those people who are most at risk, if you're over 65, if you've got significant pre-existing illness. Make a plan with your GP about which drug is best for you, how you'll access it when you test positive, if you test positive, and what you might need to modify in terms of your normal medication. They can have drug interactions, so you need to make a plan in advance, but they can make a really big difference. And we've seen a doubling in terms of the number of people who are taking these oral therapies in recent weeks with the expanded PBS criteria, which is really good news. More than 10,000 prescribed per week in Victoria recently. So that's a doubling from where we were at 2 or 3 weeks ago. But we need all of these interventions kind of working in concert to be able to get through the really significant challenges that we're facing at the moment. The final one is ventilation. If you can open doors and windows wherever you're meeting, if you can meet outside instead of inside, and I know it's really cold some days in Melbourne, but if you can open those doors and windows, that will make a significant difference in terms of the risk of transmission. If you can't and you have to meet indoors, then those HEPA filters that can filter potential viral particles in the air can make a huge difference as well. So they're really important pillars as we go through this wave, and recognise that we ain't out of this yet. Happy to take questions.
Brett, you spoke about personal responsibility not being enough. Your deputy obviously recommended masks be made mandatory indoors. Would that still be your advice?
Yeah, that's still public health advice. That's one of the inputs in final decision making on pandemic orders. You know, there are mixed results from looking at mandates in Australia and internationally. There have clearly been times when mandates have increased the compliance and the coverage of mask wearing very substantially, but we've been at different points with different social views about masks. Sometimes masks mandates have not made a significant difference, but it does depend on the general messaging that's being given. I think we're being really clear now about the benefits of mask wearing. Victoria's had a bit of a checkered history in terms of some of the anti-mask rhetoric. I would just reiterate that there is one view amongst public health experts in Australia, amongst all chief health officers, the chief medical officer federally, the CDC, the WHO, the European CDC, the Public Health Association of Canada. They are all saying the same thing about masks. They will put a downward pressure on transmission. They are good for you individually, and they are absolutely the right thing to do through a challenging wave.
So does the government need to look at this advice again, potentially accept the advice of,
Look,
on masks indoors?
there is always a process of review as we go through different phases. We need to see what the behavioural response to the call to be wearing masks is now. I see a difference. I've only been back in Australia a little while, but I can see that there's higher levels of compliance in mask wearing. That's a really good thing. And so, yes, that can and should be under review all of the time. Whether that leads to a different view about pandemic orders is to be seen.
Would you want a mandate now?
Well, look, the public health recommendation was to consider a mandate, but it is for the Minister to make pandemic orders with consideration of all of those other inputs that she receives.
So to clarify, that you would like a mandate now, but you concede that the government said no.
Well, that's the pandemic legislation that we have in Victoria. That's what Parliament agreed, and you know, the Minister is accountable in that regard. The public health recommendation is what it is, but there are broader considerations that I completely accept that the Minister has to take account of.
When you did last make masks mandatory over that Christmas summer period, I asked why, and you said if you mandate something, you'll get about 90-95% compliance. If you don't, you'll be lucky to get 50%. We don't get to see the modelling. So as a result of the decision not to make masks mandatory in this way, what impact do you think that's going to have on case numbers or deaths? How much worse off are we going to be?
Look, I think it's difficult to model that. We don't know exactly how behavioural responses occur at this point in the pandemic. We were in a time in Victoria where we were all highly sensitised to a single case. We were wearing masks indoors and out in every conceivable setting, and so there was absolutely high compliance with those mandates. But that was a different era, and that was mainly driven by, you know, a fantastic kind of communitarian response in Victoria to the challenges that we faced. We had to drive down from relatively high numbers in the pre-vaccine era down to zero, and so we all pulled together. We're at a different phase now, and what the social behavioural response will be to a mandate versus really strong messaging is hard to predict.
Do you feel as though you've been silenced by the government recently?
No, here I am. And look, I'm always active on Twitter. I'm very happy to speak to public health issues of any kind. And I'm here today to answer any questions that you have.
But given you've become such a trusted and well-known face throughout this entire pandemic, given that we are going through another critical wave, would you prefer to be able to speak to the public more often, or maybe not prefer, but do you think it would have some utilitarian value?
Look, I think people are reasonably hungry for information. There'll be people who are sick of the COVID story and can turn off, but I think it's good for people to have an opportunity to access information. There are various channels that can happen. It's a nice reflection to think that I can be a trusted voice. And yeah, I'm always happy to accept an invitation that comes through to me to be able to speak.
But has the government told you at times not to speak?
No, they haven't.
Can I ask you, you said you think we're at a peak. We know that not every positive case is being reported or that people are even testing. So where do you think we actually are at in terms of cases per day?
Oh, look, I think we're probably capturing around half, but it is very difficult to know. You know, we've got about 15-17% positive on PCR testing for everyone who tests on a daily basis. That's trending down. That's a reasonable indication that we're doing a decent amount of testing, and Victoria is one of the best places in the world in terms of availability of RAT tests. And so I think we've got pretty free testing for symptomatic individuals, but you don't capture everyone. RATs will pick up a lot of symptomatic individuals, but they're not perfect. And of course, there are a lot of people who'll have sniffles, a bit of a tickly sore throat, who won't necessarily test. I encourage them to do so because, again, if you can test, you know to isolate and you're protecting those vulnerable around you.
What can you tell us about the influenza going through the community at the moment? I guess the confusion some people might have between those symptoms or COVID symptoms.
They're pretty hard to sort out. Influenza obviously can cause sore throat, headache, fever, runny nose. The flu season is almost through. It was a pretty substantial wave when it came, but it largely hit in June, July, and is not quite at baseline, but is very close. That's a good thing in terms of our health system again. We don't need a really substantial flu peak to carry on through August. I don't think it will, but we need to bear in mind there are other viruses out there, and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, affects kids, still being seen in decent numbers, and still causes reasonably significant illness, including in the very young.
You'll be asked at the end of August to provide updated advice to the Premier and the Health Minister on whether the pandemic declaration should continue. Will you suggest to them that it will need to continue past winter, or do you think we may be able to come out of this wave enough to not require that declaration?
Oh, like any time in which I'm providing advice, we take a look at the epidemiology, the risks and trends at the time. We're some time away from that potential October date, but we'll look at it at that time and make the determination that we see fit.
He'll ask for a review at the end of August, though.
That's right, and yeah, we'll provide it. We're not at the end of August, and we'll work it up. It is difficult to say well in advance of time. I think, you know, we'll continue to see a trend down in numbers, but we really don't know what the horizon might look like.
Should it be time for those under the age of 40 to have access to the fourth dose?
Look,
Sorry, under the age of 30.
The option is there for people who are 30 and above. ATAGI have made that recommendation. They are focused. ATAGI is focused on keeping those most at risk out of hospital. They recognise that there's a little bit of a decline in transmission if you get immunised, so there might be a benefit for those under 30 with respect to putting downward pressure on transmission. But people under 30 are at very minimal risk of being hospitalised, and that's I think, I don't want to speak for ATAGI in full, but I think that's a big part of their rationale for not offering it to under 30s. Obviously, people who are immunocompromised are eligible, and so those people who are at risk of being hospitalised of any age group remain a recommendation for the 4th dose.
On that 4th dose, a lot of people have wondered, my parents included, do you get it now or do you wait for something like the Moderna one, which we hear is going to be more designed for Omicron? What would your advice be?
I've said it many, many times, the best vaccine is the one you can get now. I wouldn't wait. We're in a COVID soup right now. There is a lot of transmission around it, and you would not want to defer getting protection that you can get when there is so much transmission. If there are better, more precise, variant-specific vaccines on the horizon and they're not that far away, fantastic. But they'll be a consideration for everyone down the track as well. I wouldn't wait for it while you remain vulnerable, because it's been 6 months since the 3rd dose.
I know you've only just come back, but have you had any guidance from the AHPPC or ATAGI as to when that might become available in Australia?
No, not particularly. Look, ATAGI will provide advice on that, or the Chief Medical Officer, but I haven't heard it through AHPPC.
I just wanted to ask, we haven't asked you about monkeypox.
Yeah.
Obviously that's been looked at a little bit differently, but just really quickly, on Simon's question about the pandemic declaration, we're pretty certain that COVID's not going anywhere. At what point does a pandemic shift to becoming an endemic thing, to the point where we don't need the same gravitas behind these rules?
Look, I think we're already there in terms of a slow transition away from really strong measures. Clearly, that's the case. We've got fewer protections in place in terms of pandemic orders than we've had previously. But it's on a spectrum, and there's no kind of dichotomy of saying, oh, we don't need to do anything from this point in time. We will need to be mindful of and reflective of the threat of COVID for years to come. Unless there's some game-changing vaccine that makes it go away, which I don't think is a prospect for the next 12 months, 2 years, we'll need to bear in mind the wearing of masks, the isolation when you're unwell, not turning up to work, not seeing vulnerable people. So, even if the pandemic declaration ends, the communication will need to be strong, and the guidance and sustained behavioural change will need to be there.
Do you think that'll also extend to the 7 days isolation post a positive test?
Again, we need to reflect on how many people would continue isolation if there weren't a mandate. I think people are understanding about why that's in place and how important it is to remain in isolation when you're still positive. I'll make no recommendation about changing the length of time that isolation is required at the moment. The Omicron variant, you're certainly infectious for 5 days. And if you're symptomatic, you need to remain in isolation until you've recovered. So that's not going to change for some time.
And just back on, where are we at with monkeypox? Is it an issue in Victoria? I mean, we know it is overseas, but where are we at currently?
Look, it's an issue in as much as the risk is there. We're going to see growing numbers. Clearly, it's in a pretty explosive phase in North America at the moment. 1,000 cases a day just recently. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and as people travel internationally to Europe, to North America in particular, there'll be the risk of importation of cases into Victoria. So we need to absolutely keep an eye on it. It's not as dangerous as COVID, but it has the potential to increase in numbers, and because it's skin-to-skin contact or close, intimate contact, we're all vulnerable in one way or another. So we need to make sure that people are aware of symptoms, make sure they're getting tested if they've got compatible symptoms, to make sure that we've got a robust surveillance system and laboratory system to back it up. And we need to explore getting vaccines to protect those most at risk. But vaccine supply is a challenge internationally. There aren't enough vaccines for all of those at-risk individuals. So we'll need to do our best with the classic public health controls of isolation of cases and follow-up of their close contacts.
How was your holiday?
It was good.
Just like riding a bike, Brett. Thank you.
Thanks so much.